Hi everyone, and welcome to a very different kind of documentation talk. I'm really excited to virtually be here with you all, and even more excited to share my expertise around documentation and ancient history. So let's get started with documenting the ancient history of your project. My name is Natali Vlatko, and I look after open source engineering at Wayfair, which is an online e-commerce platform for homewares and furnishings. You might be wondering, why this talk? Well, having completed my studies in ancient history and Egyptology during the climax of the Arab Spring, my career in archaeology was somewhat flatlined, so I pivoted to my second passion, which is tech. I've found that working with the open source community has taught me a lot about the intersections of ancient and modern tech. And more importantly, open source's documentation standards have been eye-opening for a traditionally enterprise company like ours at Wayfair. So take this talk with the context of my own learnings from open source docs and how we can all incorporate this into documentation throughout any facet of our technical work. I'm currently located in Berlin, Germany. I'm Croatian by descent. I also grew up in Australia and have previously lived in Singapore. So I'm very excited to also speak to you all about the different places that you've lived in your lives. Let's now go through today's agenda. First off, what is ancient historical context? We'll look at the information that explains tech choices and the decision-making that often frames these. What can we learn from archaeology? We'll seek to understand the human activity involved in technical projects. The when and how of documenting context. Where does context belong? What tools are necessary to understand it? Timing and nuance in your documentation. How do you amend or add to what I like to call heritage documentation? And finally, giddy up because you're about to be served with a wealth of Egyptology facts. It may not come as a super surprise to you, but I'm really into dead things, having studied ancient history and archaeology before, so it'll be peppered all throughout this talk today. So now let's start with an ancient history lesson to frame this conversation a little bit better. The great Pharaoh Hatshepsut, she was the most kick-ass pharaoh ever, and she took on the imagery of a man and declared herself pharaoh over her younger stepson turned husband in the 18th dynasty. It's very Game of Thrones-like, the whole ancient Egyptian world, so it's a good way to frame that kind of thinking. She was only the second female pharaoh ever to reign, and her major accomplishments include trade networks after the Hyksos occupation and prolific building projects such as her mammoth mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. Basically, she paved the way economically for ancient Egypt to thrive and scale. And as you just saw, lots of cats involved in ancient Egypt, and a couple likely to be making an appearance in my talk today too. So I mentioned Deir el-Bahri, and I want to touch on this again a little bit more. It's famously associated with Hatshepsut, this particular complex, and the mortuary temple is a colonnaded structure that preceded the Parthenon by a whole 1,000 years. The first monument here was associated with a pharaoh called Mentuhotep II, and he reigned during the 11th dynasty and famously reunited ancient Egypt after the first intermediate period. This is important because we can see here that Hatshepsut was looking to associate herself with someone else of great deed and stature, and tastefully built amongst rather than on top of the previous buildings and monuments that were there. Then our next character, Thutmose III, decides he wants power, and let me tell you, after the death of Hatshepsut, Thutmose III created one of the largest empires Egypt had ever held, with 17 military campaigns conducted throughout his entire reign. He had served as head of Hatshepsut's armies while she was in power, thus his military prowess was to become legendary, and all afforded by Hatshepsut herself being able to look after the entire administration while he was able to hone his military craft. He also paid great attention to construction at Karnak, which is one of the largest temple structures from ancient Egypt and currently still standing today. He then went on to erase her name from some of the other larger buildings that she had erected during her time in an attempt to usurp her success, which is a very unfortunate part of Tutmosis' history for us archaeologists. Now, the collection of pharaohs and monuments that I've just spoken about all try to piggyback off of context or replace it, perhaps, in terms of defining their success and building upon that success further. This can be an example for us here today when looking at the success of technical projects and how documentation reflects this. Let's walk through some examples of what this context could look like. A major codebase refactor from many moons ago, moving from one programming language to another. An important business-critical deadline that sped up the development lifecycle of a project. Movement or restructure of a software team and their ownership space specifically. Or dependencies on other teams or systems that restricts a project's roadmap or growth. Often, as new members join a project or other folks need to onboard, questions could arise why certain things are the way they are. Why did you write this piece of software in this specific language? Why didn't you go with something else? You might be able to answer some of these questions, but there will come a time during the life cycle of this project where that information becomes lost. Documenting what decisions have affected the outcome of your project is particularly important here, if only for the amount of time we'll save debating the current state of work and then purposely working to improve it. Knowing why, specifically around different projects, will empower your people to be more aligned to the mission or outcome of the work, meaning they'll be able to come to solutions more creatively and more effectively. That in itself is an awesome reason to document these explanations, and from the slide previously, be able to outline why specifically. So with that, what can we learn from archaeology to assist us on this documentation quest today? Well, firstly, it's all about humans. Archaeology is the study of the human past using material remains. These remains can be any objects that people created, modified, or used. Creation, modification, and general usability is something that open source, documentation, and archaeology specifically have in common. The word archaeology comes from the Greek word archaios, which means ancient. It's also likely better pronounced than how I've just attempted there. Although some archaeologists study living cultures, most archaeologists concern themselves with the distant past, as I did previously in my studies. If we think about the meaning of legacy in terms of code in this way, there is a common overlap here, something that is part of your history or that remains from an earlier time. I, as I previously mentioned, prefer to use the term heritage to describe this kind of term and this kind of usability, because I feel like it has a better ring to it, and also it has a better connotation and thus better way of people being able to approach it specifically. Now, to go a little further into archaeology, there are two major disciplines that we usually study. There's prehistoric archaeology, which looks at civilizations with no writing, and historic archaeology, that looks at civilizations with writing. Historic archaeology incorporates the written records into the archaeological research itself. This picture that you see on your screen is the Rosetta Stone, which was uncovered from the Ptolemaic period of Egypt and has famously led to our modern understanding of hieroglyphs and ancient Egyptian writing. Famously also, it was discovered by Napoleon's forces in Egypt in 1799 and is one of the most famous cases for historic archaeology to date that we have. What I'd like to now draw your attention to is some concepts that we can use simultaneously with documentation, coming from archaeology. Now, in archaeology, we note that remains which are portable are called artifacts, whereas remains which cannot move, such as temples or tombs, large buildings and structures, are known as features. This terminology could also be adopted by us for technical use, as some already are, in that we are often updating features, yet inserting or removing artifacts from a particular project. Another concept we could look at is looking at records that tell us how civilizations used a specific feature. With historic archaeology, we're incorporating writing, so there was often a lot of information accompanied by a lot of the features that have been discovered. In archaeology, we observe, record, categorize, and interpret, and it's often something that we usually do not only in technical projects, but also when we're creating documentation. And most archaeology involves digging, lots of it, something that's likely not a surprise to most folks here. But what could be surprising is that before we dig, we specifically use a lot of evidence and sampling techniques to specifically select a site. So when we're usually digging into a certain technical project to find different things that are going to be really relevant and useful to us, a little bit of research needs to go into understanding and knowing where to actually look in the first place. The same kind of concept is also shared here with archaeology. So with all of this, in the end, tech projects are merely human projects that tell us a succinct story that we can certainly control through very robust and well-written documentation. Let's not leave our work to the interpretation of code archaeologists of the future. Let's take a page out of Hatchepsut's book and pay respectful homage to the decisions that have come before us. This is where we'll get into the essence of how to document context. Now, I'm already predicting your first question. Where does context belong? Where should we fit it amongst our current formatting and templates? Let's uncover what's currently the norm today. Documentation structure might look a little bit like this in your project or organization. In bold, I've highlighted what the minimum standard for open source projects currently is as an example. But even the enterprise world can structure their documentation in this way, which I often try and do at Wayfair. Aside from the usual readmes and contributing information, further templates for issues and a glossary for your project will further educate the community about your workflow and terminology. This kind of enhanced structure is really great, but there is still something hidden, and purposely so, that can be an add-on for your documentation. This might be something really interesting to discuss among documentarians, but what I'm referring to here is the humble commit message. This is an interesting topic specifically, and they're great additional resources for documentation because they're patiently waiting in the background, attached to the specific change that you're looking into. Now let's look at what makes a good commit message for you as the user to digest. Well-formed commit messages are vital for context. So what we're looking for is the essential information that's going to help us understand the commit in question. We want to start with a subject line as a concise summary so the user reading the message knows exactly what the rest of the information will contain. This subject line is specifically used by GitHub throughout its entire UI, so it's going to inform more than just folks specifically looking into the commit message itself. Big technical details can then go into the body of the message, much like an email when you're sending one out. And so more information, more technical depth will be able to still be revealed further down in the message. And then finally, for reading purposes and for usability specifically, we want to wrap your message to 72 columns for the ease of reading. This way we can account for the many different types of ways that people will actually look into these messages, how they work with different UIs and with different types of software. So let's assume we have a healthy amount of well-written commit messages. What other tooling is required to keep up our documentation game in the face of historical context? We touched previously on documentation structure, and I want to make the case to go beyond the current template form here with you today. Who's to say that we can't add a decisions_context file, for example? Why would we leave something like this out if a major refactor changes the outcomes of certain technical elements of our project? It requires effort, but going beyond the minimum and adding more documentation is more often than not going to actually be a win-win scenario for your readers and for your project maintainers. Granted that we're referencing said documentation as necessary throughout the usual doc experience for our users. Not so subtle hints in your README or in your contributing file can do wonders to alleviate the work you put in to answering questions from your community, as well as being able to onboard new members to your project more efficiently. There are always going to be those who want to dig even deeper, however. After all, we are talking about archaeology. And so with that, we have a specific tool at the ready for folks who do want to dig a little further. That is the Git pickaxe. For developers, if they're ever confused about a line of code and want to know what was going through the mind of the other developer when they were writing it, the pickaxe should be the first tool they reach for. Often, developers will run git blame on the specific line they're focused on to find the last commit, but that doesn't give even close to the same amount of context and information that using the Git pickaxe specifically will. Just like the archaeological tool, the Git pickaxe uncovers the why beneath the code. Granted that your developers are also caring to write well-informed commit messages, as we mentioned previously. So, with this tool in hand, what does the pickaxe uncover exactly? It focuses less on who made the change and more on what the change is and does. Git blame is unfortunately called as such so as to blame the previous developer for your current code problems. With the pickaxe, it's all about the contents of the commit. That includes context such as metadata and the commit diff. That is that treasured, uncovered information that answers a lot of other questions for you. On top of this, you can combine with other log filters to enhance your search, to really dig as deep and as specific as you need to find what you're looking for. At the same time, what we also want to look at is wondering why we even bother with code comments if we have commit messages. Now, they are rather two distinct practices here. Code comments occur and are visible directly in our code, but are specifically crafted to be short and not always so sweet. Commit messages, on the other hand, can be longer and more detailed, allowing for that context we're looking for and making sure it's communicated and shining through. They're also purposely hidden behind the commit, so to speak, so that these messages aren't in the way for people who want to strictly look at code. And finally, with such an amazing set of tools, we want to actually evangelize their use. We want to evangelize use of specifically the Git pickaxe. As documentarians, we want to encourage our developers and teams to create commit messages and to use the pickaxe through their usual workflow, as well as throughout our own documentation. By doing so, we're purposely showing the world that there is more information waiting to be discovered, concerned primarily with the code that it lies beneath. It won't happen overnight, but gentle encouragement from our side to use these best practices will result in a lot more understanding and clarity around the context we're so desperate to document. Now the question of when. When do you include context? If not at the beginning of your project, then have you missed your window of opportunity, perhaps? This is where I'd like to particularly cover timing and nuance in your documentation. If we hark back to our ancient Egyptian tale from earlier in the talk, you remember that Thutmose III chose to purposely remove Hatshepsut's name from certain feats of the kingdom after she died, and well into his own established reign. Unfortunately for him, his choice of timing uncovered some of his motives and didn't actually achieve the desired result, which was not actually crediting Hatshepsut for her feats in the kingdom. What we want to ensure then is that we've united our documentation. I've chosen to purposely feature Mentuhotep II here again, as he was the great reuniter of the Kingdom of Egypt and the pharaoh that Hatshepsut specifically chose to reside beside in her mortuary temple. Ensuring that our documentation is united in terms of structure, formatting, and direction around best practices will mean that timing doesn't need to be an issue when it comes to adding or amending heritage documentation. This will also ensure better onboarding for new folks to your project. Having your documentation united in terms of workflow and design on top of content itself means folks who are new to your project are onboarded more efficiently, and their why questions are answered with you having paid extra attention to documenting context. They'll be able to jump into the challenges you're looking to solve within the realm of context you've outlined for them, understanding their boundaries and the possibilities before them as well. Having continued reference to the different tools you're wanting them to use creates that habit of usability of these tools. And when new folks come along, they're likely to replicate those same behaviors if they're still contained in the documentation as references. And speaking of nuance, archaeologists don't often express it, but Thutmose III had it really good. He had a regent and pharaoh's stepmother/wife who looked after the place while he was off playing war games and having a young adulthood that was much less stressful than what was to come for him ruling the ancient Egyptian kingdom. Aside from the insidious sexism of the pharaoh system, Thutmose III reaped the spoils of inheriting a kingdom that was in top working order, so he could just come in, see the gaps, and fill them. Having great documentation will lead to absolutely similar results, I assure you. So, to summarize our archaeological adventure into documenting context, decisions affecting your project should be recorded, regardless of when they occurred and regardless of when you're actually adding in that context. Explaining why ensures use and gives clarity to the folks involved. After all, we want people to use our work and to understand why they should be doing so. Go beyond templates and create context documentation to help facilitate this. Make your own rules to unite and fortify your documentation practices. Commit messages are great secondary sources. And I say this here with a little bit of nuance, in that secondary is actually a term we use in history as a source once removed from the real or original source. So I have to include here that I'm merely stating the use of secondary as more so complementary to our overall documentation. And finally, there is a tiny archaeologist inside of us all. We've all gone digging around for more information or context before, so we know what to look for. Let's all be ardent archaeologists and documentarians and create that context today and make it easy to find for others. For those of you who enjoyed the Egyptology thread of this talk, here are some great references to start with around the general topic and in particular with Hatshepsut, one of my favorite pharaohs from the Egyptian era. For those local to Berlin, Germany, the Neuss Museum houses the bust of Nefertiti, which is stunning to see, and from a period in ancient Egyptian times that is incredibly unique and artistically different from the rest of what we know of the New Kingdom. I urge you to check it out if you're local here. In terms of resources around documentation, I use the following sites and presentations as inspiration for my content, And I'm more than happy for other folks to ask any kind of questions around what else I gleaned and learned from these resources. Thank you so, so much for going on this ancient historical journey with me, and a big thank you to Write the Docs for having me speak. I've been Natali Vlatko, and I look forward to meeting you all at the rest of the conference.
We have some questions, but I think maybe while people are kind of like trickling in, I'm curious about like your journey, like what made you really make that switch, you know, that career switch, or kind of like, I don't know, what was the moment that you realized you wanted to be doing this?
Yeah, okay, I can talk a bit about that. Or do you want me to answer that now?
Yeah, I mean, you can talk a bit about that now, just while people are kind of trickling in.
Yeah, I basically, during my master's studies in Egyptology specifically, I did my master's that was coursework based, which meant that I would go out to digs and actually get experience on the ground, so that as soon as I left university, I'd be able to actually work in that field directly because I had the experience. And then the Arab Spring happened in Egypt. And so that meant basically that a lot of our digs were destroyed. There was no protection from our university to be able to go to Egypt and continue the work. And I was already doing tech stuff on the side. So I thought, oh my gosh, I'm studying for so long, I need a job now.
Relatable.
Right. And it was and it was really easy to jump into what I was doing as a hobby while I still was trying to figure out career-wise what I'm supposed to do with all of this degree and like all of these masters under my belt. Like, what do I actually do with that? And then being able to like actually jump into the workforce made me figure out that actually that's what I wanted to actually continue doing and stay in tech specifically.
I love hearing everyone's journey into tech. I think from of course there's the kind of more traditional route, like through computer science, but I think especially in this community, there's so many different ways people get into it. And
totally. Yeah. And it's like,
for being open.
Yeah. And I think the language backgrounds too, like a lot of people without a computer science degree specifically give such a really unique perspective that's like very, like similarly to what I talked about, human, that is like super missing in like a lot of areas. So yeah, I'm a big fan.
Cool. All right. We have a couple questions, so I'm going to dive into those as much as I would love to just like sit and chat. So the first one is, what would your advice be to start writing good commits on a team?
Oh, great question. So my first good commits is something that I take specifically from when I try and write emails specifically, which is this idea of answer first communication. And so what we talk about in commits, in terms of like good writing in commits, is having a subject line that's very concise and to the point, so that for someone that needs to kind of dig very quickly and needs that information fast, the answer is first in what the actual commit is kind of doing and what it's giving you, and thus it's in that subject line already. And then you can dive even deeper into the technical background of what that commit does in the body of your message, similar to an email. So it's kind of like writing like a TLDR, or like knowing by the subject of your email what you're actually in for. The same goes for commit messages. You want to have something that's super concise. So again, you're giving that answer first. And thus you're actually usually then prompting people to read even further into the commit because they already know that this is what they're looking for.
Oh, that's such great advice. Admittedly, I've been a developer for a couple of years now, and I recently learned that you could, fill out your body of your commit message, like probably less than 6 months ago. So I'm glad we're giving that a shout out right now.
For sure.
All right. The next one is, do you ever get tempted to make these ancient artifacts up to date while preserving their authentic essence, so to speak? And if yes, how do you ensure that the essence of the original is maintained?
That's another really good question. And I think that's where I think documentation and like project work and archaeology can really differ, in that in archaeology, you want to see like the older version or the original version really in all its maybe gory, not so well-kept glory, so to speak. Whereas like in project documentation, that's specifically when you're referring to things like in like context and decisions, you want reference to it, but it doesn't need to be that messy original structure. You can clean it up a little bit, but knowing why the cleanup is taking place, for example, or why you've chosen to make a certain decision and thus documenting that. That's what I think that's more important. And so when we talk about preserving the old, we want to preserve the old in maybe the reasoning why we're at the current space we are today in a certain project or in a certain type of documentation. But I don't want to actually see maybe the original docs unless it's your cool GeoCities page from the 90s, because they're really awesome. But usually you want to actually make sure docs are updated and maybe reference to previous things rather than keeping the complete original.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And then I'm wondering, as someone who's also a career changer, when you're introducing these kind of practices in your work, do you reference like where you learned this kind of workflow? Do you talk to your colleagues about that? Or do you just kind of, I don't know, not mention it?
Yeah, I often mention it specifically because I mentioned previously, I don't have a comp sci background, but I'm in tech. And a lot of my colleagues have varying backgrounds that are either comp sci or they do boot camps or so on, or people with, funnily enough, my boss has a classics background, and he's the head of all of infrastructure and platforms at Wayfair. So what's interesting about that is that people that often come from backgrounds that are very technical, they and I get into really interesting debates about documentation because of what we feel is actually really essential and important to include. And so it's coming from me and my context in terms of I need the whole picture to understand what that picture is, whereas they're like, I only need this certain thing because I'm concerned with like one part of this project or one part of this outcome. And so I'm a big fan in like talking about why my background I believe is important because of this whole context requirement that I often have. And I think that's an interesting way in terms of how we learn specifically too. Like people have a lot of different learning styles. Some people are visual, some people like are big note takers. I'm a big note taker. And so the way we learn too is also going to actually influence the way that we produce documentation and resources for learning specifically. So having like interesting talks about my background and mentioning certain things as a way to kind of get to these solutions together in terms of docs is actually something that can be sometimes like a little bit polarizing with opinions, but it's also super interesting for me. And yeah, I have a lot of random Egyptology references that a lot of my coworkers don't get.
Well, it seems like a lot of people in the chat are agreeing with you that having these different perspectives is excellent. And that is part of why I love this community. And I love that you mentioned the idea of like keeping in mind people's different like learning styles and doing that. I don't have a specific question related to it, but I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah, and it's something that Ursula specifically, who might be in the chat or was watching my talk, also brought up in terms of accessibility, which is something that I'm still learning a lot about too in terms of my presentation. And so understanding how people actually also take in more information that I can also improve my own way of delivering for different learning styles, super important.
Oh my gosh, amazing. Well, Natali, it was so nice to have you here today. Your talk was incredible. I already mentioned, I learned so much about ancient history that I literally knew nothing about. A lot of dead things for October, which is great. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Awesome. Yes, thank you for having me. Thanks for everyone for welcoming me. More than happy to answer more questions as you have them. Feel free to DM me anytime.